Andy I've known for a very, very long time, and one of the things that is the most unique about Andy is he and I, we general chaired the first and the only so far IDID conference, which stands for Interaction Design for International Development in 2010, along with which we co-hosted along with India HCI, like here in ITC. And Andy has been sort of part of the TC13 for several years, and he's been sort of very active and we go to him as a resource person at all times. You know, if I have any doubt, we go to Andy to ask him. Okay, so over to you, Andy.
Okay, thanks. So yeah, yes, I've known Anna for a long time. I think it's 2006. So yeah, it's going back a little while, and over that time, I've learned a lot from Aniruddha, and I've learned a lot from other people in this space, thinking about interaction design and interactive experience design for development. And so what I wanted to talk about, rather than sort of saying, oh, here's this wonderful gadget that I designed sometime that's had this, because I haven't, okay? I have not designed anything that had a transformative impact. And so the question is, well, what's actually going on here? And that's what I really want to talk to you about today. And it's the question of what exactly are we doing and how are we thinking about doing it. And I think this title, IxD for what, I think I have to give some credit to Dorothea Kleiner, who wrote a paper called ICTD, or ICT for what. So you can look that up and look at her thoughts on that. Because the for what, I mean, this module is about IxD for development, and so if you're trying to do something for some objective, it's kind of a good idea to have an idea what that objective is. So the question is, what is development? I'll find that out to you, actually, since you're sat there, and I can see lots of you sitting there thinking, well, I'll take some notes on this. What do you think development is? I mean, they signed up for the module.
Bettering a way of life for people for whom it could be better in a comparative sense.
So something about better ways of life. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what's
more answers?
Yeah.
Betterment without degrading others. Whatever has been the standard without degrading.
So better without making anything worse for anybody else. So without changing anything fundamentally.
The higher standard of living in a sustainable way.
A higher standard. Right. So there's a question about sustainability as well as the higher standard of living. Yes, because we know that if all of us had the same consumption patterns as Europe and North America, we're all doomed. In a word. And okay, so we've got some questions about what are the limits to development. So okay, so we're not going to go to the next slide.
Yeah.
So we're not just beginning from this sort of naive idea that development implies more roads, more neon lights, more mobile phones, more aeroplanes, whatever. That's actually not sustainable. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see that this question about wanting to make the world a better place, there are some sort of fairly serious limits on what we have to think about. I mean, these images highlight various aspects. There's some issues around erosion with farming practices. That's a shot of a Delhi skyline, and the levels of smog. And I know that urban air pollution is a major issue in India at the moment. The shot top right is a place called Agbogbloshi, which is in Ghana. And one of the issues with IT for development is who ends up handling the waste. Interestingly, China has recently told Europe that it's no longer interested in running Europe's recycling operations and plastic recovery operations, and it is intending to move out of that market completely. So Europe will have to deal with the plastics that it produces. And the other shot is, I think, a beach in Senegal, but I did see a news item recently about cleaning up plastic waste from the beaches in Mumbai. That we have these issues of what kind of a sustainable development, a better standard of living actually might look like. And if we go to the next slide, I've got a couple of slides here of particular stories that question these ideas of development. Because you're going to have the slides, I'm not going to read this story about the fisherman and the businessman. I suspect you've come across the story of the fisherman and the businessman, and you know, why is the fisherman sitting on the beach just looking and enjoying the sunshine, and the businessman tries to persuade him that really he should be out there fishing to get more money to invest in boats so that he can have a fleet of other people fishing, and then he'll be able to sit on the beach and watch the sunset, which is what he's doing right now. But another way of putting that is on the next slide, which comes from a book that's very popular in the UK. I don't know whether any of you will have come across it, but it's a thing called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it just asks some questions about ourselves and our notion of how intelligent we are. So I think this idea that perhaps, you know, the dolphins were a lot smarter than us, and that they were just playing around, mucking around in the water. So, okay, so if we're not going to buy into that idea of development as just more technology, more consumption, more products, then what are our alternative perspectives on development? And I want to show you just a sort of little range of those on the next slide. So you did talk, you know, you did raise that question about, you know, what is a sustainable kind of development, and the notion of sustainable development was really kind of developed in late 60s, early 70s, and there was a report to the UN called the Brundtland Report, which looked at these questions and tried to come up with a way of looking at development that wasn't just about gross domestic product, how much money is being pumped into the economy. and that sort of led to this question about sort of thinking about human development. So a very common metric that's used a lot by the United Nations in the current sort of period is this idea of the Human Development Index. And you can see that the Human Development Index thinks about different aspects of what a good life might look like. So education is one area of a good life, and being able to understand what's going on and engage with the world that you're in is crucial. Obviously, health and a long and healthy life is really crucial. So one of the interesting results in relation to a long and healthy life, when it's compared with what people normally talk about in national comparisons of who is most developed, it turns out that if you're an African American, a black American, your life expectancy is on average lower than if you were born in Kerala. So the quality of long and healthy life in Kerala, which is not usually seen as highly developed as North America, is actually very good in that comparison. And then there's another nice idea, which is sort of thinking about it. But if instead of thinking about these things that go into measuring development, you actually sort of think about, well, actually, you want people to be happy. I mean, it seems quite reasonable to think in terms, well, yeah, does money necessarily make you happy? And so there's a little video, so I'll see whether we can actually successfully play this. So Deepak, can you have a go at that?
Sure.
The Simple Show explains gross national happiness. This is the fourth Dragon King of Bhutan, a beautiful country at the eastern end of the Himalayas. He became king at the age of 16 in 1972. It was then when he had to decide what should be the philosophy behind his reign. He looked at other countries and noticed in most of them the government and the people strive for economical wealth. And those few who achieve this goal usually live a comfortable life. But on the downside, many other people live in misery, poverty, or social isolation. Also, in the ruthless hunt for money, huge parts of the environment are often destroyed. This couldn't be the right path for Bhutan. The concept of gross national happiness was born. The primary idea of GNH is that every human being aspires for happiness, and a country's development should also be measured in its citizens' happiness. The fourth Dragon King's challenge, therefore, was figuring out how to balance economic development with the emotional and spiritual well-being of his people. Although economical growth can't be the only goal, a flourishing economy gives the government the funds needed to provide a working health and educational system, as well as certain living standards. Because being healthy, having opportunities for the future, and knowing that security, a steady income, housing, or well-balanced time use are guaranteed is crucial for people to be happy. But furthermore, people get a lot of positive energy from being with others and sharing interests. Participating in cultural life and to hold up local traditions and cultural heritage lead to a stronger community feeling. Healthy family relationships, advocating community activities, and religious aspects are factors for achieving happiness. It gives the Bhutanese people a strong sense of values and identity. The fourth Dragon King reigned 34 years, basing his decisions on all factors of gross national happiness, asking himself, what makes Bhutan's people happy? And the fourth Dragon King lived by example, leading a very simple life. In fact, he believed so strongly in the concept of GNH, he even decided to hand over sovereignty to the people. In 2006, he retired as king at the age of 51 and changed the course of history. 2 years later, in 2008, Bhutan elected its first representative parliament. Since then, the idea of gross national happiness has taken quite some momentum outside of Bhutan, with other countries and people around the world thinking about adopting the GNH approach to strive for development with values and to make the world a happier place.
Okay, we're back.
Okay. So, I mean, there's another way of looking at, what's the objective that you're trying to reach. The final one I would point to is this idea of development as freedom that Amartya Sen developed and Martha Nussbaum, thinking about development as people's ability to choose lives that they value, that they have reason to value. So thinking about people actually choosing the kind of development that they want for themselves, rather than us choosing what we think might be in their best interests. So there are kind of questions here about what are we trying to achieve and who's actually making the choices, who's actually deciding what is good for people. So I want to move on from that sort of question about what are we trying to achieve to thinking about, well, what's the context where we're working. So if we go to the next slide, I'd like to show you a model that's used. It was developed by the UK Department for International Development. Well, it was developed by various researchers advising DFID, trying to understand the situations that people find themselves in that affect what their life outcomes are like. So if you look on the right of this diagram, you've got this sort of end goal of livelihood outcomes. So what sort of income, health, your situation, how does that come out? And of course that then feeds back into the resources that a person has. So the pentangle is a vision of the kinds of resources that people have that they then use to work out their lives. And actually, if you think about your own situation, if we look at the next slide, these elements of the pentangle talk about things like the financial capital that we have, the physical capital, the tools and the tools that are available to us, the social capital, the connections, the people we know, our own personal skills, and natural capital is our situation. So whether that's roads, it's the physical environment around us. And I mean, you're currently undertaking these studies at IITB, and you're actually you've used some financial capital, you've used some of your social capital to understand, what the possibilities are. Obviously, you've used your skills in order to get yourself accepted into the institution. you're using physical capital, you're using various tools. You might have laptops and other, you might have various means for getting yourself in and out of the university. So, you're using these things to work out your livelihood strategy. And if we go to the next slide, and you consider these questions of, okay, if that's how people are living their lives and they're trying to work out ways of living, they have to develop a strategy, they have to make choices, and that will give outcomes. But a lot of those choices and what happens for people is going to be determined by the policies, the processes, the institutions, the organisation, the surrounding environment in which they're sitting. So you are not only very bright, but you probably have got all sorts of aspects of where you have grown up and the situations you've encountered that have enabled you to develop this strategy. And so if we want to sort of make a change in the outcomes for other people, perhaps we don't need to focus so much on that pentangle and produce devices or solutions that individuals are using. Actually, a lot of the outcomes that people can attain are going to be dependent on those notions of policy, institution, processes. So things like the kinds of health services that are available in rural areas or in deprived areas of Mumbai will make a big difference to people. And those areas might be places where we can get more bangs per buck, more impact by actually working with the institutions that are affecting what the lives of the poor are going to be working out. So and what's interesting here is this is a systems model. This is a complex system. It's got lots of interacting parts. And as designers, I mean, we encounter complex systems. We're used to thinking about the complexity of context. And what do we know about that? Well, one thing we know, if I go to the next slide, one thing that we know is that whatever we design has to fit within that ecosystem. Somehow it has to be something that works in that context. This isn't actually the cassava processing machine that a friend designed, but it was an interesting story he told me, and this is a picture of a cassava processing machine. I don't know. I don't know whether people grow cassava in India, but cassava is a root crop, and it's a sort of rather misshapen and complex thing to peel and to grind. It's a staple crop for large areas of West Africa and large areas in Africa, I know. And the point about this is the point on the right of the slide is that if you're trying to develop a low-cost, maintainable, rural cassava processing plant, there's a big difference between those two items on the right. And I wonder whether the designers amongst you can figure out what's the important difference in terms of the sustainability of that design in that ecosystem.
the lower one might not, like for the lower one you might not need a spanner to screw it and unscrew it, but for the upper one you do.
You absolutely need a spanner, and you know, if you're in a remote area, a spanner is not something, and certainly a set of spanners is not something you've got any chance of guaranteeing. So actually going, you know, looking at those fine details can make a big difference to whether you've got a sustainable design. So, thank you. I think the other thing to remember about ecosystems and complex systems is that quick fixes tend not to work terribly well. You can see the dominoes, but I wonder about the thing that you can see on the left. Does anybody know what that diagram is of?
Are we on the next slide now?
Next slide, yes, sorry.
Yeah.
It's not kangaroos.
Kangaroo fence.
It's not a kangaroo fence. It is a fence.
A rabbit fence.
It's a rabbit fence. Do you want to explain what the rabbit fence is?
So Australia had this rabbit problem as they were eating crops and in fact they started even farmers were asked to shoot rabbits at sight. So the rabbits actually were brought in. They were not indigenous to Australian ecosystem. They were brought in by some of the European travelers, and when they reached Australia, they had they had very conducive environment, and there were no predators for rabbits. So they thrived, and rabbits multiply fast. So they thrived, and they started eating crops. Farmers were given mandate to shoot rabbits at sight. In spite of that, the problem became so bad that they had to actually build fences across Australia, running from north to south of Australia. And by the time they finished the first fence, the rabbits had already crossed over. So they had to finish. They had to build second fence. Some of them crossed over by the time second fence was built. So there was a third fence that was built. So finally, they didn't cross over to the.
Yeah, and the rabbits were a solution to food security. The rabbits were brought by European settlers because, well, it's a very rapid way of having meat. But yeah, and one of the things with ecosystems is that, and complex systems, is that quick fixes don't tend to be the best way of moving things along. You need things that are going to fit into the existing system, and the system has to grow its way to some new configuration. So if we go through the next slide, because I think I don't need to teach these people these things because they're so sharp. It's terrific. So we can skip the next slide. And let's start thinking about how we set about the problem. So the question is, if we're doing this kind of work and we're trying to attend to the ecosystem, be sensitive to what's going on, and find something constructive to do, then who's going to be the hero in this story? So I looked for a couple of images that might ask this question about, well, what's the role of the designer, and how do we as designers come into that space to support some notion of development and growth that actually has got some chance of connecting to the ecosystem and being a sustainable change and not be just introducing rabbits. So on the next slide, I want to show you a sort of example of how we might think about, or we might be tempted to think about, our role as designers. And this is a lovely Instagram account. I thoroughly recommend you go and have a look at this. And this is Barbie Saviour. So, and you can see here that Barbie's saying, who needs a formal education to teach in Africa? Not me. All I need is some chalk and a dose of optimism. It's so sad that they don't have enough trained teachers here. I'm not trained either, but I'm from the West, so it all works out. And, you know, there's another, there's an app that you might want to look at. I didn't embed it in this. The URL is whitesave, as one word, whitesave.me. Okay, so whitesave.me, and go and have a look at that. It's an artistic work to get you thinking about how you relate in this work of trying to do something constructive with the skills that you have, and that's great. I mean, it's good that you want to do constructive things with the skills that you have. That's a good thing. So here's another solution from Barbie Saviour. You know, clearly such a, you know, such a obvious solution to the problem of gathering water. Okay, so if we go to the next slide, it starts to ask questions about, actually, if we're going to engage in this work, how do we relate with people that we are working with? So here are a couple of pictures of people working with microfinance self-help groups, and I just see one kind of obvious difference between these two pictures, and I'm just wondering whether you can see the difference.
The instructor is sitting on the chair in the first picture, and the second one is.
Yeah. And in relation to that, there's another lovely thing you can look at, which is I think called Radiaid, and it's a charity record that's been produced. Well, have a look at Radiaid. Radiaid, it's a charity record produced by Africans to send radiators to Norway, because, you know, Norway's frighteningly cold. And they produce some very interesting materials. So on the next slide, there's an interesting resource that they produced for travellers who, I mean, a common thing for Europeans and North Americans and Australians is to have a gap year before going to university, and often during that gap year people will go off and engage in voluntary work in different places, but often they'll be doing that in countries that are significantly less rich than where they've come from. And the questions about what is the relationship between ourselves and the other people who we are working with to change ecosystems. And I mean, the point is actually the relationship is we are all human beings and we live on the same planet and we have very similar lives. At the bottom level, the things that affect us and the nature of life is that we are connected. And so in thinking about our relationship and how we approach this work, a lot of what we need to do is actually understand ourselves and the way that we come into the situation. So the last slide I want to show you is something that was produced by some people who work in a remote tribal area in Malaysia. So this is the University of Malaysia in Sarawak. And they've been working with an indigenous community for a number of years. And over that time, a lot of researchers and students from around the world have come to UNIMAS and have spent time working with and conducting research with the people in this indigenous community. And the people in the indigenous in the community were beginning to feel that, you know, they needed to orient people. They needed to prepare these students before they came to their village, because they felt that the whole thing had become extractive, that actually these researchers were coming in, sort of doing their thing and leaving, but the community wasn't really benefiting much. I mean, the researchers were getting degrees. You know, you are, perhaps you might go on from this module, you might do your final year project in this area, and hence you will benefit, you will get a degree. But what are the benefits that the people that you work with, what will they get? Will they get a prototype that doesn't, you know, have any long-term functional benefit? You gain, and so what are the gains, and what is the relationship, and what is the basis on which we might be working with people whose situation is, we think, less fortunate than ourselves, but what is the basis on which we work with them to design and explore what technology might offer? So that's the last slide.
Andy, you mentioned that when the students have a break here, they go to places, and you say which are not rich.
Yeah.
So but richness is a very large term, because the places where they go could be culturally rich or rich in other dimensions.
Yes.
So the students come with a sense of, I'm going to here to this new place, which is not rich, or which is actually more rich than where I come from.
I think it's certainly these things are not. It's not a linear measure. It is a place that is different, and the people that you will meet there have knowledge that you don't have. They have understandings. I mean, one of the questions I thought I might ask about the Steve Jobs picture I showed was, what do you think would happen to Steve Jobs if if you just parachuted him into some of the situations that you encounter? And, if I position myself, if I had a couple of bigger to farm, what would happen to me? Well, I would starve because I have no knowledge of farming. But I also don't know how to operate socially in a rural Indian village. I don't have any of that background. On the other hand, I have these huge benefits, so I'd be able to ring somebody up and they can take me out of that situation. But it's actually recognizing that the people that we're working with have knowledge, they have values, they have much to offer, and they also have objectives, and actually enabling them to think about getting involved in their project, what they're interested in, not just seeing them as means in our project.
Thank you.
Yeah. The question is related to the happiness index that you talked about. So,
Yeah.
Kingdom of Bhutan, they follow a gross national happiness index. And they started that in the year 1972. So since then, what they're following is all their policies, laws, all those are driven by the national happiness, like a gross national happiness index, rather than the GDP. So in that, what happens is that the welfare of the citizens of the Kingdom of Bhutan, starting from education, healthcare, everything is taken care of by the kingdom. So in the last 30 years, what Bhutan has achieved is that they have become a carbon neutral country. Sustainable point of view, that's really good. But the flip side of it is that now the Kingdom of Bhutan, the problem that they are facing is, since all the healthcare, education, and everything is being taken care of by the kingdom, so the people are not really ready to work there. So now the kingdom so now the government there is facing a problem, like how to arrange for the resources or the finance and everything. So how do you see, whether there is a need to redefine the happiness index or include some other criterias? What is your take on that?
Well, I think with those things, often there's a thing about the balance between the present and the future. And actually, a lot of these issues about sustainable development, it's about the balance between the present and the future. Because one of the things that you can do with the metric of happiness is, if it doesn't consider those long-term impacts, then you can use up, if you like, you may have a stock of resources. So I don't know, I might have lots of wine down in the kitchen in my house, and if I drink it and eat it all today, then tomorrow there will be none. And so, part of the thing with those metrics is, to what extent are they taking into account those long-term futures? I mean, if you take that view and you look at GDP has the same problem, in that it doesn't ask the question about, well, what is the long-term impact? Because GDP as a metric totally fails to take into account global warming. It says increase in GDP is fine, and if that makes the planet unlivable in your lifetime, then I think probably the issue with that happiness index is that question about, are you just taking a snapshot now, or are you thinking about the long-term sustainability of the framework you're having? I guess there's always a problem if you rely on one metric, and actually some of the well, let me get this right. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. So be careful.
So I have a question that you spoke about the importance of policy, institution, and processes in your slides, and I wanted to know how we as students can learn more about it, because usually what happens is that if we take such subjects to work on, let's say for example the education system, usually because of the complexity of of the system, we usually have to kind of narrow down on the problems space. So how can we learn more about that? And also second question sort of isn't it a bit of an irony in the term ICT for development itself, because we've acknowledged the fact that technology indeed cannot solve all problems that we have. So
Yeah. Okay. So so let me see. There's the irony in ICTD. I'll come back to that. But your first question was, I've lost it for a moment. Could you just remind me? The first question was.
So I just.
Oh yes, about policies. Yes, you were saying about that policy level. I think the way I tend to think about this is in terms of, as designers, we're often in a position where we're going into a situation for some constrained amount of time in order to provide some input, and then we're going to leave. And so the question is, within your ecosystem, who is going to ensure and sustain the things that you're inputting? So one of my sort of general feelings is that in ICTD, it's usually a mistake to think in terms of trying to design things for for marginalized end users, because you're not going to have so it's usually better to try to look for partners and organizations who are on the ground, who are going to be there when you have left, and work with those. So working with the health system, working with the it's working with the school system, it's working with the health system, it's working with agricultural extension systems, it's working with NGOs who are if you can help them do their job better, then you can make a contribution. And I think that's usually the better thing for technology designers to do. On your second question about ICT, I think ICT for development is, yes, it is it is perhaps a contradiction. I mean, it might be better to think in terms of I don't know, development enabled by ICT. So if certainly you want to put development is the goal. And part of the problem is that, part of the issue is that ICT for development, if you're sort of trying to do that, then you're constantly going to find the problem that you get there and you think, actually, well, except, I'll tell you a story. I went to on my second visit to India, I think I went to Patna in Bihar, and I met some people who were running a statewide program or a statewide microfinance initiative. And there was a guy from the World Bank there, who was he was waffling on about dropping laptops into villages and stuff. I mean, he was talking rubbish. He was talking total rubbish. Anyway, they had this multi-crore program of having these self-help groups and capturing the savings with an IT system. And so Subodh, who I was working with, he was building the IT system, the back end and the database for capturing all this stuff. And they had printed a whole load of blank exercise books, which they were then suggesting would be used by the self-help groups in the villages. So these exercise books, I mean, they had lines in, but they didn't have they weren't structured. So you didn't have the members of your self-help group appearing in the same order every week. So if different people came at, in different weeks, you were just going to have this chaotic mess arriving as your exercise book, which then has to be transcribed into an IT system. For a few thousand, a couple of lakhs, they could print out, if they had designed that paper system correctly, they could have a viable project. Their paper system was going to ruin this entire program. The entire program was going to be a complete waste because the paper system was not properly designed. Now, that, paper is an information and communication technology. So I think, yes, it may be that you come into a situation and you think, actually, there isn't a solution that involves information and communication and technologies for information and communication, but an awful lot of organizational challenges do come down to information and communication. And so long as you have a broad idea of what a technology looks like, then there may be space for ICTD.
In the last few days, we came across projects which used very high-end technology, latest technology like virtual reality, and we also came across examples where there was very minimal use of technology for development. And where do you think the real potential is? Should we be looking at trying to incorporate latest technology? Fitting into the context.
Personally, I think if you're going to have a sustainable system, then the first thing you do is you look at what is currently present on the ground. What are the technologies and practices that are happening now? And if you look at those closely, you can then see opportunities for perhaps changes in those practices. Because actually, it's not the technology that makes the difference, it's the practice that the technology enables. So I did at one point think, well, perhaps we should be talking about ICPD, so information and communication practices for development, and that might kind of get us out of this mess.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Clearly, we established that development is not equal to GDP of a country.
Yeah.
Then, then I think in the similar manner, we just can't say that GNH is the only index to measure the development of a country because if we go by the Sustainable Livelihood Framework (DFID), then
Yeah.
we'll see that it's only applicable to marginalized end users, and it cannot extend to people who actually to countries where people belong and make pages like Barbie Savior and.
No. I mean, my situation is the same. I have a pentangle of resources, and perhaps we can categorize our resources in different ways. And I operate in a particular social and economic and physical environment, and I work out a livelihood strategy, and it has outcomes and it affects it. So that model, that account of how things work is I think a reusable account that you can apply broadly. I do think that there are multiple ways of thinking about how you measure your progress and how you measure better. What do you consider to be better? So I think Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's stuff about development as freedom is a very useful way of understanding these things. These are ways of understanding a complex, messy reality. The world is enormously complex and messy. And so we have some tools that help us to think about it, but we've got to remember that the map is not the territory. The reality is out there, and actually it's going to be in those kind of human relationships with other people that richer reality becomes clear.
I just wanted to say one more thing, I'm just adding on to it, because if that way we would say that no country is developed if we go by.
No, absolutely not. I mean, every country. We all. It can be better. It can be better. It can be more sustainable. No, clearly not developed, and there are some really stupid choices being made. And hopefully a new generation can wake us up to some of those choices and get us making some better choices.
I had a question. So more like an academic question actually. So how does ICT4D fit into the whole appropriate technology movement that was going on earlier?
Well, I think that's. I mean, for me, that's the real nub. Is that I think a lot of what goes on in the ICT4D field is really not taking on the lessons of the whole appropriate technology movement. And actually, if you start thinking about, well, Linus Kendall, a PhD student of mine, is working at the moment on sort of thinking about the relationship to autopoietic systems, and actually understanding that if we view these, he's working with an NGO in West Bengal, in fact, and collaborating with Triple IT Bangalore. but we're sort of trying to approach that from that perspective of saying, well, okay, what is this NGO already doing? What are the technologies it's already using, and how might we contribute in small ways into the environment that's there? I suppose the challenge with ICT, well, with modern ICTs is, and the relationship to appropriate technology is one about independence and interdependence, because part of what the appropriate technology movement tries to do is enable communities to operate completely independently in maintaining the technologies that they use. Whereas, in relation to modern digital ICTs, none of us are independent. We're totally interdependent. The number of plants that are producing the chips that are in all our smartphones globally is, you can count on one hand. So, those ARM chips that are running so many phones. So, how you actually relate that? But I think part of that is you've got to accept that those technologies are rolling out there, and if you can work with the technologies that are in place, the hardware and software that's in place, and the practices that are in place, then there's an opportunity for learning and improving performance. And that's something that IxD practitioners can really help with.
Thank you.
So thanks a lot. Are there any questions? Any more questions? We are slightly over time, but they have. So none. So thank you very much, Andy, and it's really been great to have you here and to talk to us and give your thoughts. We were getting too optimistic in the afternoon, and so I'm very glad that you are.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So, but yeah, I mean, this is really a challenge, and in fact, this is the. I try to tell this to my students without discouraging them too much, that the most common complaint that I get back from people that we work with is that the student comes, asks some questions, then leaves, and I don't know what happened. And so this is a concern actually. And so on the one hand, we want students to work on these areas, and we know that they're going to not be there in a short period of time. And there is so much more opportunity, particularly working out of India. I mean, we are surrounded by it. So we want them to work in this space, and we don't have necessarily ongoing projects with each of these partners at every point in time. And so there is a challenge on balancing the learning, the education, and the actual development. Yeah, so I am sort of.
I think it's understanding that we're all learning. We're all learning, and if we can all learn together and see our role as part of that, then we might get somewhere.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for spending time today and giving us your talks, and really enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Okay.